The millionaire went to take a taxi, and when he saw the driver's ring, he started to break into a cold sweat. Alexander Blackwood stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office in central London, watching the morning rain trace patterns on the glass. At 53, he had achieved everything society deemed worthy of success. CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, one of Britain's leading technology firms, a fortune that placed him firmly among London's elite, and a reputation for business acumen that earned him regular features in financial magazines. Yet on this particular Wednesday morning in September, none of that seemed to matter. His perfectly ordered world had been disrupted by something as mundane as a car breakdown. His beloved Aston Martin, usually as reliable as his stock predictions, had refused to start, forcing him to do something he hadn't done in years: call a taxi. Rather fitting, he muttered to himself, straightening his bespoke suit jacket. The rain matched his mood, a peculiar melancholy that had been creeping up on him lately. Despite his achievements, something felt missing, a void he couldn't quite name. His executive assistant, Margaret, knocked on the door. "Mr. Blackwood, your taxi's arrived." "Thank you, Margaret." He gathered his briefcase, umbrella, and the portfolio containing documents for today's board meeting. The timing couldn't have been worse. He was presenting a major acquisition proposal that could reshape the company's future. The lobby of his Mayfair building gleamed with marble and brass, and Thomas, the doorman, rushed to help with his umbrella. Outside, a black taxi waited, its engine humming quietly against the morning drizzle. As Alexander approached, the driver's door opened and a young woman stepped out. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore the standard uniform of London's taxi drivers, but something about her carried an air of quiet dignity that caught his attention. "Good morning, sir. Heading to Canary Wharf, are you?" "Yes, Blackwood Enterprises headquarters," he replied, sliding into the back seat. The interior smelled of leather and something else, a faint trace of jasmine perfume that triggered a distant memory he couldn't quite place. As they pulled away from the curb, Alexander found himself studying the driver through the rearview mirror. There was something oddly familiar about her features, though he was certain they'd never met. Her eyes, visible in brief glances, were a striking shade of green that reminded him of... His thought process halted abruptly as a flash of silver caught his eye. On her right hand, resting on the steering wheel, was a ring he recognized instantly. His heart seemed to skip a beat, and the portfolio nearly slipped from his fingers. That ring. He knew every detail of it. The unique Celtic design, the small emerald nestled within the silver knots. He had spent weeks designing it himself 26 years ago, working with a jeweler in Edinburgh to create something special for Charlotte. Charlotte Williams. Even thinking her name after all these years caused a tightness in his chest. Their relationship had been intense, passionate, and ultimately devastating. She had disappeared from his life without explanation, leaving nothing but a brief note and years of questions. "Are you all right, sir?" The driver's voice pulled him from his reverie. "You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine," he managed, though his mind was racing. That's an interesting ring you're wearing." The young woman glanced at her hand, a soft smile crossing her face. "Oh, this? It was my mother's. She gave it to me on my 18th birthday, said it was special." Alexander's throat felt dry. "Your mother? What's her name, if you don't mind me asking?" Charlotte Williams." The driver navigated through the London traffic with practiced ease, unaware of the effect her words had on her passenger. "I'm Emma, by the way. Emma Williams." The portfolio slipped from Alexander's hands, scattering papers across the taxi's floor, but he barely noticed. His world had suddenly tilted on its axis, and all he could focus on was the young woman in the driver's seat, her green eyes, so like Charlotte's, the familiar curve of her jaw, the ring he had designed so many years ago. Emma Williams. Could it be possible? The timing would be right. Charlotte had disappeared 25 years ago. The resemblance was undeniable. And that ring... "Let me help you with those papers," Emma offered, starting to pull over to the side of the road. "No, please," Alexander said quickly, gathering them himself with trembling hands. "Just keep driving. I need to think." The rest of the journey passed in a blur of calculations and memories. Alexander's mind raced through possibilities and implications, each thought more overwhelming than the last. By the time they reached Canary Wharf, he had made a decision. He needed to know the truth. As Emma pulled up to the impressive glass tower of Blackwood Enterprises, Alexander took out his wallet. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "would you be available for another journey this evening? Say, around 6? Emma looked surprised but checked her schedule. "Yes, I suppose I could be. Same pickup location?" "Perfect." He handed her several times the fare amount. "Please keep the change." "I'll see you at 6. As he watched the taxi drive away, Alexander took a deep breath of the damp London air. The board meeting, the acquisition, all of it seemed trivial now. After 25 years of questions, he might finally have found an answer he never expected. In a chance encounter with a taxi driver wearing a very special ring. The board meeting passed in a fog. Alexander moved through his presentation mechanically, his usually commanding presence somewhat diminished by the morning's revelation. If the board members noticed his distraction, they were too polite, or perhaps too intimidated, to mention it. Back in his office, he cancelled his afternoon appointments and pulled out his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing Charlotte Williams London into the search bar. Hundreds of results appeared, none seeming to match the woman he'd known. Charlotte had always been private, eschewing social media even in its early days. His mind drifted back to 1998 when he'd first met her. He'd been a rising star in the technology sector, ambitious and driven, while Charlotte worked as a literature professor at Edinburgh University. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, yet something had clicked between them instantly. "Mr. Blackwood?" Margaret's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your son James is here to see you." Alexander quickly closed the browser. "Send him in." James Blackwood strode into the office, every inch the 30-year-old successful businessman he'd been groomed to be. His suit was perfectly tailored, his manner confident, perhaps too confident, Alexander sometimes thought. "Father, I heard you took a taxi this morning. Is everything all right with the Aston?" "Just a minor issue." "The mechanic is looking at it." Alexander studied his son's face, so like his own, yet lacking the softness he'd noticed in Emma's features. James was the product of his brief marriage to Victoria, a union that had dissolved amicably after 5 years when they'd realized they wanted different things from life. "Well, make sure they fix it properly. Can't have the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises riding around in taxis." James laughed, but there was an edge to his voice that Alexander chose to ignore. "Actually, James, I wanted to ask you something." Alexander paused, choosing his words carefully. "Do you remember me ever mentioning someone named Charlotte Williams?" James's expression remained blank. "No, should I have?" "One of your old business associates." "No, nothing like that." Alexander stood and walked to the window, watching the afternoon light play across the Thames. "She was someone I knew before I met your mother, before Blackwood Enterprises became what it is today." "Father, is everything all right? You seem different today." Alexander turned to face his son. "James, what would you say if I told you that you might have a sister?" The silence that followed was deafening. James's face went through a rapid succession of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. "A sister? What are you talking about?" James's voice had lost its usual polish. "Is this some kind of joke? This morning I met someone. A young woman who—" Alexander's voice trailed off as he realized how incredible it all sounded. "I need to be certain first, but I thought you should know that it's a possibility." James ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture Alexander recognized as one of his own. "Does this have something to do with that Charlotte person you mentioned?" "Yes. She disappeared 25 years ago without explanation, and this morning I saw something that made me think—" Alexander picked up a silver letter opener from his desk, turning it over in his hands. "I need to know the truth, James." His son's face had hardened into an unreadable mask. "And what happens if it is true? What then? Do you expect to just welcome this taxi driver into the family? Into the company?" "I haven't thought that far ahead," Alexander admitted. "But if she is who I think she is, then yes, she has a right to know her family, to know me." James stood abruptly. "I hope you know what you're doing, Father. We've worked too hard, built too much to risk it all on some romantic notion about a long-lost daughter. This isn't about the company, James. This is about something far more important." "Everything is about the company," James snapped. "Everything we have, everything we are, it's all built on Blackwood Enterprises. You taught me that yourself, As James stormed out of the office, Alexander sank into his chair, feeling every one of his 53 years. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time, 4:30 p.m., an hour and a half until he would see Emma again. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old leather diary. Inside, preserved between its pages, was a photograph from 1998, himself and Charlotte at a garden party in Edinburgh. She was wearing the ring he'd given her, her green eyes, Emma's eyes, sparkling with laughter. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Blackwood?" The mechanic called. "They say your car will be ready tomorrow." "Thank you, Margaret. Please cancel my dinner meeting this evening. Something more important has come up." Alexander stood and walked to the window again, watching the city begin its transition from day to night. Somewhere out there, Emma Williams was driving her taxi through these streets, unaware that her life, and his, was about to change forever. He thought about James's reaction and sighed. This wouldn't be easy, but then again, nothing truly important ever was. The question was, how does one tell a complete stranger that you might be their father? And more importantly, how does one make up for 25 years of absence, even unintentional ones? At precisely 6 o'clock, Alexander stood outside his Mayfair building, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. The rain had cleared, leaving behind a crisp autumn evening with streets that gleamed under the city lights. Right on time, the black taxi pulled up to the curb. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," Emma said as he settled into the back seat. "Where to this evening?" Alexander cleared his throat. "Actually, I was hoping we might talk. There's a small cafe in Hampstead, I know. Would you be willing to drive us there? I'll compensate you for your time, of course." Emma's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, curiosity mingling with professional caution. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate, sir. I'm on duty and—" "Please," Alexander interrupted, his voice softer than he'd intended. "It's important. It's about your mother's ring." The taxi remained stationary at the curb, its engine idling. Emma's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and Alexander could see her weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. "You knew my mother, didn't you? That's why you were so interested in the ring this morning." "Yes," Alexander admitted. "I knew Charlotte many years ago in Edinburgh, before you were born." Emma pulled away from the curb, merging into the evening traffic. "The cafe in Hampstead, then. Thank you." They drove in silence for several minutes, the streets of London flowing past their windows. Alexander studied Emma's profile, noting how she had Charlotte's delicate nose, but a determination in her jaw that reminded him of himself. She drove with the same focused precision he applied to his business dealings. "My mother never talks about Edinburgh," Emma said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I know she taught there, but whenever I ask about that time in her life, she changes the subject." "She was a brilliant professor," Alexander said. "Victorian literature was her specialty. She could quote entire passages from Jane Eyre from memory." "She still can," Emma smiled. "She used to read it to me when I was little." The smile faded slightly. "How did you know her?" Alexander chose his next words carefully. "We were very close for almost 2 years. The ring you're wearing, I had it made for her." Emma's hand flexed on the steering wheel, the silver ring catching the light from passing street lamps. "She told me it was from someone special, someone she'd lost touch with. I never pressed for details. Mum's always been private about her past." They were approaching Hampstead now, its elegant streets lined with Victorian houses and boutique shops. Alexander directed Emma to a small side street where a cozy cafe sat nestled between a bookshop and an antique store. "Would you join me for coffee?" he asked as they pulled up. I think there are things you should know." Emma turned off the engine and sat still for a long moment. "Mr. Blackwood, why are you really here? What's this about?" "I believe I might be your father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 25 years of absence. Emma's face went pale, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "That's not possible," she whispered, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "My father, Mum said he moved to America before she knew she was pregnant. Said she never heard from him again." "Charlotte left Edinburgh in March 1999, Alexander said quietly. "She left a note saying she needed time to think, that she couldn't be with me anymore. I tried to find her, but she'd resigned from the university, changed her number. She disappeared completely." Emma turned in her seat to face him fully for the first time. In the golden light from the cafe windows, the resemblance to Charlotte was striking, but Alexander could see himself too. In the set of her chin, the analytical look in her eyes. "Why now?" she asked. "Why after all these years?" "Because until this morning I had no idea you existed." Alexander's voice cracked slightly. "If I had known, if Charlotte had told me she was pregnant, I would have been there, for both of you." Emma closed her eyes, taking several deep breaths. When she opened them again, they shone with unshed tears. "I need to call my mother." "Of course," Alexander said. "But perhaps we could talk first? There's so much I'd like to know about you." Emma stared at the ring on her finger, twisting it absently. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this. It's too much to process." "I understand," Alexander said, though his heart sank. "But would you at least join me for coffee? We don't have to talk about any of this if you don't want to. Just let me get to know you a little." After what felt like an eternity, Emma nodded slowly. "One coffee, but I'm not making any promises beyond that." They stepped out of the taxi into the cool evening air. The cafe's warm light spilled onto the pavement, and through the window, Alexander could see comfortable armchairs and shelves lined with books, the kind of place Charlotte would have loved. As they approached the door, Emma paused. "Mr. Blackwood?" "Yes?" "That book you mentioned, Jane Eyre. The copy my mother read to me. It had an inscription. Something about our own fairy tale." Alexander's breath caught. "Written in green ink on the inside cover." Emma's eyes widened. I think maybe we should have that coffee after all." They entered the cafe together, father and daughter separated by 25 years of absence, brought together by a silver ring and a chance encounter on a rainy London morning. Neither knew what would happen next, but as they sat down across from each other, both felt the weight of unspoken questions and the possibility of answers long overdue. The cafe was quiet at this hour, with only a few other patrons scattered among the mismatched vintage armchairs. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, and the walls were lined with well-worn books, the kind of atmospheric setting that seemed to encourage intimate conversations. Emma ordered a cappuccino, while Alexander chose Earl Grey tea. They sat in a corner nook, the awkwardness between them almost palpable. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she removed her taxi driver's cap, revealing more of her dark hair that fell loose around her shoulders. "You said the inscription was in green ink," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could you know that?" Alexander set his tea down carefully. "I wrote it. Charlotte, your mother, she always used to carry that book with her. One day I borrowed it and wrote the inscription. To my dear Charlotte, may we write our own fairy tale. Love, Alexander." The green ink was because it matched her eyes, Emma finished. "She told me that part. She said it was from someone who once knew her better than anyone else." She paused, studying his face. "I used to imagine what you might be like." "What did you imagine?" "Someone artistic, maybe, a writer or a professor like Mum." Emma gave a small, confused laugh. "Not the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises." "I was different back then," Alexander said softly. "Ambitious, yes, but not quite so corporate. Your mother used to tease me about my business plans, said I needed to read more fiction and fewer financial reports." "She was right about that," Emma said, then bit her lip, as if surprised by her own boldness. Alexander smiled. "She usually was. That's one of the things I loved about her. She never hesitated to challenge me." He hesitated, then asked, "What was it like growing up with her?" Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeming to draw comfort from its warmth. "It wasn't always easy. We moved around a lot when I was young. London, Manchester, Bristol. Mum was always freelancing, teaching at different universities. But she made sure I had everything I needed. She's incredible, really. Strong, independent, stubborn," Alexander added with a fond smile. "Definitely stubborn," Emma agreed. Then her expression grew serious. "Why didn't you try harder to find her?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. "I did try. I hired private investigators, contacted her friends, her family. But Charlotte was clever. She'd cut all ties, changed her number, moved away. Her family either didn't know where she was or wouldn't tell me. After a year, I had to accept that she didn't want to be found. And you never knew about me." "Never," Alexander said firmly. "Emma, you must believe that. If I had known Charlotte was pregnant, Nothing would have kept me away. Nothing. Emma studied him intently, and Alexander could see her mother's analytical mind at work behind those familiar green eyes. "I believe you," she said finally, "but it doesn't change the fact that you weren't there, that Mum had to do everything alone." "No, it doesn't," Alexander agreed quietly, "and I can never make up for that lost time. But I'm here now if you'll let me be." Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I should call her. She needs to know about this." "Of course. Would you like some privacy?" Emma shook her head. "No, stay. You should hear this too." She dialed a number and put the phone on speaker, placing it on the table between them. The ringtone seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cafe. "Emma," Charlotte's voice, barely changed after 25 years, filled the space between them. "Darling, aren't you working?" "Mum?" Emma's voice wavered slightly. "I need to ask you something. Something important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What is it, love?" "The ring you gave me, the one with the Celtic knots and the emerald. It was from Alexander Blackwood, wasn't it?" The silence that followed was deafening. When Charlotte finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "How did you—" "He's sitting here with me, Mum. I'm his taxi driver, or I was this morning. He recognized the ring." Another long pause. "Oh, God," Charlotte whispered. "Emma, is he my father?" Emma's voice was steady now, determined. "I need to hear you say it." "Yes," Charlotte's voice broke on the word. "Yes, he's your father. Emma, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to find out like this." Alexander leaned forward. "Charlotte?" A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Alexander, is it really you?" "It's me, Charlotte. We need to talk, all of us. There's so much to explain, so much to understand." "Yes," Charlotte said after a moment. "Yes, I suppose there is. Emma, darling, where are you?" "The little book cafe in Hampstead. Mum, could you come, please?" "I'll be there in 30 minutes. Charlotte paused. "Alexander." "Yes?" "Thank you for recognizing the ring." The call ended, leaving Emma and Alexander in silence. Emma slumped back in her chair, looking suddenly exhausted. 25 years, she said quietly. 25 years of secrets, and all it took was a broken-down car and a taxi ride to unravel everything. Alexander reached across the table, hesitating before gently touching her hand. "Sometimes life has a way of forcing us to face the truth, ready or not." Emma didn't pull away from his touch. "I have so many questions." "So do I," Alexander said. "But maybe we should wait for your mother before we try to answer them." Emma nodded, then gave a small, slightly hysterical laugh. "You know what's funny? All those years of driving people around London, hearing their stories, their dramas, I never imagined I'd end up living one." "Life is full of surprises," Alexander said softly. "Some of them are even good ones." They sat in companionable silence, waiting for Charlotte's arrival, both aware that their lives had irrevocably changed since that morning's chance encounter. Outside, London continued its evening rhythm, unaware that within the walls of a small Hampstead cafe, a family's long-buried secrets were finally coming to light. The 30 minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. Emma excused herself to park her taxi properly, while Alexander ordered fresh tea and coffee. When the cafe's door chimed, they both looked up to see Charlotte Williams standing in the entrance, looking as though she'd stepped straight out of Alexander's memories. Time had been kind to Charlotte. Her dark hair now had elegant streaks of silver, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, but she carried herself with the same quiet grace he remembered. She wore a professor's outfit, a well-cut blazer over a silk blouse, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Mum," Emma called softly, and Charlotte's eyes found her daughter first, full of concern and love. Then her gaze shifted to Alexander, and 25 years seemed to dissolve in an instant. "Alex," she breathed, using the nickname only she had ever used. Alexander stood, his heart thundering in his chest. "Charlotte." She approached their table slowly, as if walking through a dream. "I always wondered if this day would come," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Though I never imagined it quite like this." Emma pulled up another armchair. "Sit down, Mum, please." Charlotte sank into the chair, her composure wavering slightly as she looked between her daughter and her former love. "Where do we even begin?" "Perhaps with the truth," Alexander suggested gently. All of it, this time. Charlotte nodded, reaching for Emma's hand. You deserve that, both of you. She took a deep breath. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after I left Edinburgh. I was going to tell you, Alexander. I'd actually picked up the phone dozens of times, but what? Alexander prompted when she faltered. But then I saw the announcement in the Financial Times. Blackwood Enterprises was expanding internationally. You were described as Britain's most eligible bachelor, the rising star of the technology sector. Charlotte's voice grew quiet. And there was a photo of you with Victoria Henderson at some charity gala. Alexander closed his eyes, remembering. Charlotte, Victoria and I weren't... It doesn't matter now, Charlotte interrupted. What matters is what I did next. I convinced myself that telling you about the baby would ruin everything you'd worked for. Your company was taking off. You were making headlines. I told myself I would be selfish to burden you with an unexpected child. That wasn't your decision to make, Alexander said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. No, Charlotte agreed, it wasn't. But I was young and scared, and I thought I was being noble. She squeezed Emma's hand. I told myself that my baby deserved better than to be an obligation, a potential scandal for a rising business tycoon. Emma pulled her hand away. So you decided I didn't deserve a father at all? Charlotte flinched. I thought I was protecting you both. I see now how wrong I was, but at the time... She turned to Alexander. You'd always been so focused on building your empire. Everything else came second to that dream. Not everything, Alexander said softly. Not you. Never you. The night before I left, Charlotte continued, you spent 3 hours on the phone with Tokyo, rescheduling meetings for the next day. You were so excited about the future, about all your plans. I looked at that pregnancy test and Her voice broke. I couldn't bear the thought of being the one to derail your life. So you derailed your own instead, Emma said. And mine. Emma, Charlotte began, but her daughter cut her off. Do you know how many times I asked about my father? How many father-daughter days at school I had to skip? How many forms I had to leave blank? And all this time, he was here in London, running one of the biggest companies in Britain. Alexander leaned forward. Emma, your mother made a mistake, yes, but she was trying to do what she thought was right. Are you defending her? Emma asked, incredulous. No, Alexander said carefully. But I understand fear. I understand making decisions that seem right at the time, only to realize later how wrong they were. He looked at Charlotte. Though I wish you'd given me the chance to prove you wrong about me. Charlotte wiped a tear from her cheek. So do I. Especially when Emma started showing such an interest in business and technology. She reminded me so much of you sometimes that it hurt to watch. Interest in business? Alexander asked, looking at his daughter with new curiosity. Emma shifted in her chair. I have a degree in business and computer science from UCL. The taxi driving, it's just temporary. I'm developing an AI-driven transportation optimization system. The practical experience helps with the research. Alexander felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by a deep sense of loss for all the years he hadn't known this remarkable young woman. That's incredible. Like father, like daughter, it seems, Charlotte said softly. Even without knowing you, she followed in your footsteps. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of revelations and missed opportunities hanging heavy in the air. Outside, the evening had deepened into night, and the cafe's warm lighting created a gentle glow around them, as if they were in their own private world. What happens now? Emma finally asked, looking between her parents. Alexander met Charlotte's eyes before turning to his daughter. That depends on what you want, Emma. I know I've missed 25 years of your life, and nothing can change that. But if you're willing, I'd like the chance to be part of your future. Charlotte reached for her daughter's hand again, and this time Emma didn't pull away. Whatever you decide, darling, I'll support you. It's time you had all the pieces of your story, not just the ones I chose to share. Emma twisted the silver ring on her finger, looking at the emerald that had brought them all together. I think I'd like to try. To get to know you, I mean, she said to Alexander, but slowly, one step at a time. That's all I ask, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. One step at a time. A week after the revelations at the cafe, Alexander sat in his home office staring at the business proposal on his desk without really seeing it. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a freshly framed photograph. One Charlotte had sent him from her phone that first night. It showed Emma at her university graduation, radiant in her cap and gown, clutching her diploma from UCL. His phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Still on for coffee this afternoon?" They had agreed to meet twice a week, taking small steps toward building a relationship. Each meeting revealed new layers of connection, shared interests, similar mannerisms, even the same habit of tapping their fingers when deep in thought. "Looking forward to it," he typed back, then added, "Bring your project proposal if you're comfortable sharing it." The response came quickly. "Really? You want to see it?" "Of course. Transportation optimization is right up Blackwood's alley." As he set the phone down, his office door opened, and James strode in without knocking. "Father, we need to talk about these rumors." Alexander sighed. Despite his attempts to keep Emma's identity private while they all adjusted, whispers had begun circulating through London's business community. A taxi driver claiming to be Alexander Blackwood's daughter. It was too juicy a story to stay hidden. "They're not rumors, James. Emma is my daughter." "So you've confirmed it? Without a DNA test?" James paced the room, his agitation visible in every movement. "Do you have any idea what this could do to the company, to our reputation?" "Emma hasn't asked for anything, James. She's building her own career, her own life." "For now," James scoffed. "But how long before she wants a piece of the company? A seat on the board? Her share of the Blackwood fortune?" Alexander stood, his voice sharp. "That's enough. Emma is your sister, whether you like it or not. And she's brilliant. Did you know she's developing an AI system that could revolutionize urban transportation?" "Oh, perfect." James threw up his hands. "So now you're going to fund her little startup? Give her a fast track into the industry while the rest of us had to earn our place." "The rest of us?" Alexander's eyebrows rose. "James, you were made vice president of operations at 27, hardly a struggle from the bottom." James had the grace to look slightly abashed, but pressed on. "That's different. I was raised for this. I understand our world, our responsibilities. She's a stranger who happens to share your DNA." "She's family," Alexander said firmly, "and she has every right to know her father and explore her heritage, including the business side of it, if that's what she wants." "The board won't like this," James warned. "They're already nervous about the succession plan. Adding another potential heir to the mix. The board will adapt." Alexander's tone made it clear the discussion was over. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to prepare for." After James left, Alexander pulled up his calendar and made a decision. He dialed Charlotte's number. "Alex?" Her voice still gave him a jolt of recognition. They'd spoken several times over the past week, beginning the long process of rebuilding trust. "Charlotte, I need your advice about Emma." "What's wrong?" "James isn't taking the news well. He's worried about the company, about his position." Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "I don't want Emma caught in the crossfire of corporate politics." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "You know, Emma's always been remarkably level-headed about these things. When she was 12, she organized her entire school's fundraising system using a computer program she built herself. The other children were jealous of her success, but she just kept working, improving the system until everyone saw its value." Alexander smiled, adding another detail to his growing collection of Emma facts. "She gets that from you, that quiet determination. And her drive for excellence comes from you," Charlotte countered. "Alex, trust her to handle this her own way. She's had 25 years of standing on her own 2 feet. "That's what worries me," he admitted. "I've missed so much. I want to help her, support her, but I don't want to overwhelm her or make her feel pressured." "Then tell her that," Charlotte said simply. "Emma appreciates honesty above all else." Wonder where she got that from. Their conversation was interrupted by another message from Emma. "About the project proposal, would you mind if I showed you the actual system instead? I've set up a test version in my taxi." Alexander felt a surge of pride and curiosity. "I'd love that," he replied. "Good instincts," Charlotte commented when he told her. Emma's always preferred showing to telling. After ending the call, Alexander walked to the window, looking out over the London skyline. Somewhere out there, his daughter was driving her taxi, not just transporting passengers but gathering data, testing theories, building something innovative, just like he had at her age. His phone buzzed again, a message from his assistant reminding him about the afternoon's board meeting. He would have to face more questions about Emma, about the future of Blackwood Enterprises, about his plans for succession. But for now, he was simply looking forward to seeing his daughter's work, to understanding the mind that had developed independently of him, yet seemed to think so much like his own. He glanced at the graduation photo again, at Emma's proud smile, and made another decision. Opening his laptop, he began researching transportation technology startups and their funding patterns. If Emma's system was as innovative as it sounded, she would need investors who understood both technology and transportation infrastructure. And who better to guide her through that landscape than her father? Emma's taxi was parked in a quiet mews near Hyde Park, her mobile laboratory as she called it. Alexander approached, noting how the standard black cab looked entirely ordinary from the outside, but as Emma opened the door, he glimpsed an array of discrete sensors and a custom-built computer interface elegantly integrated into the dashboard. "Welcome to my office," Emma said with a hint of nervous pride. She wore casual clothes today, jeans and a navy blazer over a white shirt, looking more like the tech entrepreneur she aspired to be than a taxi driver. "Impressive setup," Alexander commented, sliding into the passenger seat. The leather interior had been modified to accommodate the technology without compromising the taxi's primary function. "Watch this," Emma said, tapping the custom interface. A holographic display materialized between them, showing a real-time map of London, with pulsing dots representing traffic patterns. "I've been collecting data for 18 months. Every fare, every route, every traffic delay. It all feeds into my AI system." Alexander leaned forward, his business instincts immediately recognizing the potential. "You're mapping more than just traffic." Emma smiled, pleased he'd caught on so quickly. "Much more. The system analyzes weather patterns, public events, construction schedules, even social media sentiment about different areas of the city. It's learning to predict transportation needs before they arise." She tapped another command, and the display shifted to show a complex web of intersecting lines and data points. "Traditional ride-sharing apps react to demand. My system anticipates it. For example, it knows that when it rains during a Wednesday matinee at the Royal Opera House, taxi demand in Covent Garden spikes by 64%. But it also knows that if you position 5 taxis in specific locations 20 minutes before the show ends, you can serve that demand twice as efficiently." "Predictive positioning," Alexander murmured, "but how do you account for the human factor? Drivers won't always follow optimal positioning suggestions." "That's where this comes in," Emma said, bringing up another screen. "The system gamifies the positioning recommendations. Drivers who follow the suggestions and successfully pick up predicted fares earn bonus points, which can be converted to real rewards. In testing, I've seen an 87% compliance rate." Alexander felt a surge of pride so strong it almost overwhelmed him. "Emma, this is extraordinary. You've created something that could transform urban transportation." "You really think so?" For a moment she looked younger, more vulnerable. "I mean, I believe in it, but I don't just think so, I know so." Alexander turned to face her fully. "Listen, I know we're still getting to know each other, and I don't want to overstep, but would you consider letting Blackwood Enterprises invest in your project?" Emma's eyes widened. "What?" "No strings attached," he added quickly. "We have a transportation technology division that operates independently. You'd maintain control of your innovation, but you'd have the resources to develop it properly." I don't know what to say," Emma stammered. "I mean, I've been approaching investors, but most of them want to turn it into just another ride-sharing app. They don't understand the broader implications for urban planning and infrastructure optimization." "I understand," Alexander said softly. "Just like I understand why you're driving a taxi instead of taking a comfortable corporate job. You needed to learn the system from the inside out, didn't you?" Emma nodded, looking at him with surprise. "Exactly. Mum said I was crazy to turn down those tech company offers, but I knew I needed real-world experience to make this work. You know," Alexander said, smiling, "when I was starting out, I spent 6 months working in a computer repair shop. Everyone thought I was wasting my time, but I needed to understand how people actually use technology, not just how we thought they should use it." "Really?" Emma laughed. "Mum never mentioned that. She didn't know. It was before we met." Alexander hesitated, then added, "There's so much we have to learn about each other, Emma, but watching you explain your work just now, It felt like seeing a reflection of my younger self. Emma was quiet for a moment, fiddling with her mother's ring. If, and it's a big if, I considered accepting investment from Blackwood, would it cause problems? With James, I mean. Alexander sighed. Probably, but not because of the investment itself. James is struggling with the idea of sharing anything. Attention, inheritance, family connection. He's always defined himself as my only heir. I'm not interested in being anyone's heir, Emma said firmly. I want to build something of my own, prove myself on my own merits. I believe you, and that's exactly what makes you most like me. Alexander gestured to the holographic display. This isn't about inheriting a fortune. It's about creating something innovative, something that could help millions of people. Emma's phone chimed with a notification. Speaking of helping people, I should get back to work. I've got a regular client booking in 20 minutes. Of course. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. But think about what I said. The investment offer stands, regardless of our personal relationship. Your work deserves to be developed properly. As he stepped out of the taxi, Emma called after him. Dad? It was the first time she'd called him that. Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. Thank you, she said. Not just for the offer, but for understanding why this matters to me. That's what fathers are supposed to do, he replied softly, even if we're 25 years late to the job. As he watched her drive away, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was a message from James. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow. They want to discuss the succession plan. And Emma. Alexander texted back a single word. Good. It was time to show the board and James that Blackwood Enterprises was big enough for both his children, each in their own way. As he walked back to his office, he began planning how to present Emma's transportation system to the board, not as his daughter's project, but as a revolutionary technology that could secure Blackwood's future in the changing landscape of urban mobility. The pieces were falling into place, even if some of them still needed careful adjustment. The Blackwood Enterprises boardroom occupied the entire top floor of their Canary Wharf headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of London's financial district. As board members filed in for the emergency meeting, Alexander stood at the window watching the morning sun glint off the Thames. Margaret, his assistant of 15 years, approached quietly. Everyone's here, sir, including Mr. James. Alexander nodded, turning to face the room. 12 pairs of eyes watched him expectantly, the most powerful minds in British technology and finance, people who had helped build Blackwood Enterprises into what it was today. And at the far end of the table sat James, his expression carefully neutral, but his tension visible in the set of his shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, taking his place at the head of the table, I understand you've called this meeting to discuss recent developments regarding my family and the future of this company. Indeed, said Victoria Winters, the longest-serving board member and a close friend of Alexander's ex-wife. We're concerned about the rumors circulating in the press. A taxi driver claiming to be your daughter? It's causing uncertainty among our shareholders. Not rumors, Alexander corrected firmly. Emma Williams is my daughter. I've confirmed this with her mother, Charlotte Williams, whom I knew in Edinburgh 25 years ago. The circumstances of our separation meant I was unaware of Emma's existence until recently. And you're certain of this relationship? Asked Howard Chen, head of Asian operations. Without any verification? If you're asking about DNA tests, they're unnecessary, Alexander replied. But this meeting isn't really about establishing Emma's paternity, is it? It's about what her existence means for Blackwood Enterprises. Precisely, James interjected, spreading documents across the table. Our succession plan has been clear for years. I've been groomed for leadership. Our shareholders are comfortable with my vision for the company's future. This revelation threatens to destabilize everything we've built. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Does it? Emma has expressed no interest in taking over Blackwood Enterprises. In fact, she's building something of her own, something I believe this board will find very interesting. He pressed a button and the boardroom's screens came to life, displaying the holographic interface he'd seen in Emma's taxi the day before. A murmur of interest rippled through the room. This is the Atlas system, Adaptive Transportation Logistics and Scheduling. It's an AI-driven urban mobility platform that could revolutionize how cities manage transportation. Emma developed it independently, while working as a taxi driver to gather real-world data. For the next 20 minutes, Alexander presented Emma's work, explaining its potential impact on urban transportation and its possible applications for Blackwood's technology division. The board members leaned forward, their earlier skepticism giving way to professional interest. "You're proposing we invest in this?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I'm proposing we recognize innovation when we see it," Alexander replied. "Whether Emma was my daughter or a stranger, this technology deserves our attention. The fact that she developed it while supporting herself as a taxi driver only proves her determination and resourcefulness." "And what about the company itself?" James demanded. "Are we supposed to pretend this doesn't affect the succession plan?" Alexander turned to his son. "James, your position as future CEO isn't threatened by Emma's existence or her work, but I won't deny her the opportunity to contribute to this company in her own way, if she chooses to." "The board needs stability," James insisted, "clear lines of succession." "The board needs innovation," Alexander countered. "Fresh perspectives. Emma's work demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking that built Blackwood Enterprises in the first place." Howard Chen cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the technical specifications of this Atlas system. It's impressive. More than impressive. It's exactly the kind of innovation we need to stay competitive in the urban technology sector." "I agree," said Sarah Montgomery, their head of R&D. "The predictive algorithms alone could transform our existing transportation projects." "Mr. Blackwood, has Emma considered partnering with an established company to develop this further?" "She's been approached by several firms," Alexander replied, "but they don't share her vision for the technology's full potential." "And you think we do?" Victoria asked. "I think we understand the value of long-term innovation over quick profits. That's always been Blackwood's strength." James stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. A week ago, none of you knew this woman existed. Now we're considering investing millions in her project?" "Sit down, James," Alexander said quietly. "You're proving exactly why we need fresh perspectives in this company. Emma's project isn't valuable because she's my daughter. It's valuable because it's brilliant. The fact that she happens to be a Blackwood is secondary." Victoria leaned forward. "Alexander, what exactly are you proposing?" "Two things. First, I want the board's approval to have our transportation technology division invest in Atlas, with Emma retaining control of the project but working within our infrastructure. Second, I want to be clear that while James remains my successor as CEO, Emma's expertise should be welcomed if she chooses to contribute to the company's future." The board members exchanged glances. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "I move to approve the investment in Atlas pending due diligence. All in favor?" Hands raised around the table. Even James, after a moment's hesitation, raised his. "As for the succession question," Victoria continued, "I see no reason to modify our existing plan. However, I agree that Ms. Williams's contributions should be welcomed, should she choose to offer them." Alexander nodded. "Thank you, and James?" He turned to his son. "I hope you'll take this opportunity to get to know your sister. You might find you have more in common than you think." As the board members filed out, James lingered. "You're really sure about this? About Emma?" "Yes." "About you?" "Also yes." Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This isn't a competition, James. It's a chance to make our family and our company stronger." James nodded slowly. "I'll try. But Father, next time you discover a long-lost relative, maybe give the board a little more warning." For the first time that morning, Alexander laughed. Deal. The Blackwood Enterprises tech lab was a stark contrast to Emma's taxi workspace. Floor-to-ceiling screens displayed real-time data streams, and dozens of engineers moved between workstations with purpose. Emma stood in the doorway, clutching her laptop bag, feeling simultaneously at home and completely out of place. "Ms. Williams?" A young engineer approached her. "I'm Dr. Patricia Chen, head of the Transportation Division. We're thrilled to have you join us." "Please call me Emma," she replied, following Patricia through the lab. "And I haven't exactly joined you yet. I'm still considering the investment offer." "Of course," Patricia smiled. "Though after seeing your preliminary data, I hope you'll decide to work with us. Your approach to predictive modeling is fascinating." They reached a dedicated workspace that had been set up for Emma, a state-of-the-art development station with multiple monitors and processing power that made her laptop seem like a calculator in comparison. We thought you might like to run some simulations on our systems, Patricia explained. See what Atlas can do with real computational power behind it. Emma set down her bag, trying not to look too impressed. That would be helpful, actually. So I've been limited by processing constraints in the taxi setup. Speaking of constraints, a familiar voice said from behind them, we need to talk about integration protocols. Emma turned to find James standing there, impeccable in his designer suit, tablet in hand. His expression was professional, but there was an underlying tension that made the air feel thick. James, Emma nodded. I didn't expect to see you here. The transportation division falls under my purview as VP of Operations, he replied, and since Father is so invested in this project, I thought I should take a personal interest. Patricia glanced between them. I'll let you two talk. Emma, my team's ready to help whenever you need us. As Patricia left, Emma turned to her workstation, beginning to unpack her equipment. Look, if you're here to warn me off or protect your territory, I'm here, James interrupted, because your system actually shows promise, and because Father seems to think we should try to be siblings instead of rivals. Emma's hand stilled on her laptop. And what do you think? James was quiet for a moment, then sighed. I think that a week ago my biggest concern was preparing for next quarter's board presentation. Now I have a sister who might revolutionize urban transportation technology. It's adjustment. Try finding out your father is Alexander Blackwood, Emma countered, a small smile playing at her lips. Now that's an adjustment. To her surprise, James chuckled. Fair point. He moved closer, examining the complex diagrams on her laptop screen. Your predictive algorithms, they're based on chaos theory. Partially, Emma said, warming to the technical discussion. But I've incorporated machine learning elements that allow the system to adapt to emergent patterns in urban movement. See here? She pulled up a simulation. The traditional models treat each transportation request as an isolated event. Atlas sees the larger pattern, how one person's journey affects dozens of others, creating ripples through the entire system. James leaned in, his professional facade cracking slightly to reveal genuine interest. Like a butterfly effect in transportation. Exactly. Emma's enthusiasm broke through her own reservations. Small changes in positioning and timing can have massive impacts on overall efficiency, but most systems aren't designed to recognize these patterns, let alone predict them. Show me, James said, pulling up a chair. For the next hour, they dove deep into the technical aspects of Atlas. Emma explained how she'd developed the core algorithms, while James offered insights about scaling challenges and enterprise integration. Their initial awkwardness gradually gave way to shared professional excitement. You know, James said finally, I was wrong about you. Oh? I thought you were here to claim your share of the Blackwood legacy, but you're actually building something new. Emma met his eyes. I never wanted your position, James. I just want to create something meaningful. Like Father did, James noted. He started with nothing but an idea and a borrowed computer. Built all this from scratch. He gestured at the lab around them. Mum told me he worked in a repair shop at first, Emma said. Learning the business from the ground up. Really? James looked surprised. He never mentioned that to me. Always talked about the importance of proper business education, corporate strategy. Maybe, Emma suggested carefully, he thought that's what you needed to hear, just like he knows I need to hear about the hands-on experience. James was quiet for a moment, considering this. We got very different parts of him, didn't we? Different doesn't mean better or worse, Emma said, just different. Their conversation was interrupted by Alexander's arrival. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of his children working together, and Emma could see the emotion he tried to hide. How's it going? He asked, coming to join them. Emma was just explaining her chaos theory applications, James said. Father, did you know she's incorporated weather pattern analysis into the predictive modeling? I didn't, Alexander smiled. But I'm not surprised. Innovation runs in the family, after all. Emma caught the proud look he gave both of them and felt something shift inside her. A piece of herself she hadn't known was missing, falling into place. Speaking of family, Alexander continued, your mother called Emma. She's giving a guest lecture at King's College next week and thought we might all have dinner afterward. James, you're invited too, of course. The siblings exchanged glances. All of us? James asked. Together? Unless you're afraid of a literature professor's dinner conversation, Emma teased, surprising herself with the ease of it. Please, James scoffed, but there was a hint of a smile. I can quote Shakespeare with the best of them. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players, Emma finished, but in this case maybe we can write our own script. Alexander watched his children, hope and pride mingling in his expression. The lab hummed with activity around them, but in that moment something new was being built, not in circuits and algorithms, but in the delicate connections between three people finding their way toward being a family. Now, James said, turning back to the screens, tell me more about how you're handling data encryption for the real-time updates. And just like that, they were back to work, the future unfolding one line of code at a time. The private dining room at Claridge's had been Charlotte's choice, neutral territory for their first proper family dinner. Emma arrived early, finding her mother already there, fidgeting with the silverware in a way that betrayed her nervousness, despite her elegant appearance. "Mum," Emma said softly, "the forks are already perfectly aligned." Charlotte smiled sheepishly. "I know, it's strange, isn't it? All of us together like this. Good strange or bad strange? Both, I think." Charlotte smoothed her silk dress. "You know, I saw James on the financial news last week. He has Alexander's way of commanding a room. He's not as intimidating once you get to know him," Emma said, thinking of their interactions in the lab. "Though don't tell him I said that." The door opened and Alexander entered with James close behind. Both men wore impeccable suits, though James had loosened his tie slightly, a small concession to the informal nature of the evening. "Charlotte," Alexander said warmly, "you look wonderful." "You haven't changed a bit, Alex," she replied, and for a moment they seemed to forget anyone else was in the room. James cleared his throat. "Professor Williams? James Blackwood. Thank you for including me in the invitation. Please, call me Charlotte." She gestured to the table. "Shall we sit?" As they settled around the table, Emma noticed how carefully they'd all chosen their seats, no one directly opposite anyone else, maintaining comfortable conversational distances. The waiter arrived with wine, and Alexander took charge of the selection with practiced ease. "So, Charlotte," he said after they'd ordered, "Emma mentioned you're giving a lecture series at King's." "Yes, on the influence of Victorian literature on modern technology narratives." Charlotte's eyes lit up with academic passion. "It's fascinating how many of our current anxieties about AI and automation were prefigured in 19th century novels. That actually relates to something we're dealing with at Blackwood," James said, surprising everyone. "Public perception of AI technologies can significantly impact adoption rates." "Really?" Charlotte leaned forward with interest. "How so?" "We're seeing it with Emma's Atlas system," James explained. "The technical capabilities are revolutionary, but we need to ensure users, both drivers and passengers, trust the AI's decisions." Emma watched in amazement as her mother and half-brother launched into a discussion about the intersection of literary theory and technological adoption. Alexander caught her eye across the table and winked. "Speaking of Atlas," Alexander said during a lull in the conversation, "the initial simulations on our systems have been remarkable. Emma, why don't you tell your mother about the results?" Emma described the latest developments, her initial nervousness fading as she shared her passion for the project. "The processing power in the Blackwood lab has allowed us to run city-wide simulations. We're seeing potential efficiency improvements of up to 40% in certain areas. And the environmental impact analysis is impressive," James added. "Reduced idle time, optimized routes. It could significantly decrease urban emissions." Charlotte looked between her daughter and stepson with growing emotion. "You're actually working together on this?" "James has been instrumental in identifying scaling challenges," Emma acknowledged, "and his experience with enterprise systems has helped refine the implementation strategy. Besides," James said with a slight smile, "someone has to keep her from getting lost in the theoretical possibilities and focus on practical applications." "Now that sounds familiar," Charlotte laughed, glancing at Alexander. "Someone else I know used to need similar grounding." "I prefer to think of it as having vision," Alexander protested good-naturedly. "Vision is what got you into that incident with the prototype in '98, Charlotte teased. "What was it you were trying to prove again?" "Oh no," Alexander groaned. "Not the printer story." "Printer story?" Emma and James asked simultaneously. Charlotte's eyes danced with mischief. Your father was convinced he could modify a standard printer to create three-dimensional objects years before 3D printing was viable. He spent weeks tinkering with this poor machine in our flat. The concept was sound, Alexander defended himself. The technology just wasn't ready. The concept set the kitchen on fire, Charlotte corrected. The neighbors called the fire brigade. Really? James leaned forward. The history books never mentioned father's early experiments in arson. That's because some stories are better kept in the family, Alexander said, then paused as the weight of his words settled over the table. Family. The word hung in the air, new and delicate, yet somehow right. They were an unusual family, certainly, bound together by old loves and new discoveries, by shared genes and chosen connections. To family, Charlotte said softly, raising her glass, in all its unexpected forms. They clinked glasses, and Emma felt the last of her reservations melting away. Here they were, her brilliant, independent mother, her newly discovered father with his vision and warmth, her ambitious half-brother learning to share more than just a name, and herself, somewhere in the middle of it all, building bridges both technological and personal. You know, James said as their main courses arrived, we should show you the lab, Charlotte. See where your daughter is revolutionizing urban transportation. I'd like that, Charlotte replied, though I warn you I'll have many questions about the literary implications of your AI systems. That's all right, Emma grinned. James needs the practice with his Shakespeare quotes. The conversation flowed easily after that, weaving between past and present, technology and literature, business and family. They shared stories and dreams, gentle teasing and genuine interest, building new memories even as they acknowledged old wounds. As the evening drew to a close, Emma caught her reflection in one of the restaurant's mirrors, herself surrounded by her expanded family, all of them learning to navigate their new relationships. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, and somehow that was better than perfect could ever be. The Blackwood Enterprises press conference room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists from major technology publications filled the seats, their cameras and tablets ready to capture what had been billed as a revolutionary announcement in urban transportation. On the stage, a large screen displayed the Atlas logo, a stylized globe wrapped in flowing lines of data. Behind the scenes, Emma paced nervously, smoothing her blazer for the 100th time. She'd traded her taxi driver's uniform for a professional outfit that somehow made her feel both more and less like herself. Stop fidgeting, James said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. You're going to wear a hole in the carpet. Easy for you to say, Emma replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. You do this all the time. True, but I've never announced anything quite this impressive. He adjusted his tie, then added casually, besides, public speaking runs in the family. The easy way he included her in family made Emma smile despite her nerves. Over the past months, as they'd worked together to refine Atlas for its public debut, James had gradually shifted from reluctant half-brother to genuine ally. Is Mum here yet? Emma asked, peering through the curtain at the gathering crowd. Front row, next to Father. She's already taken out her notebook, probably planning to analyze the literary significance of technical presentations. Charlotte had indeed become a regular presence at Blackwood Enterprises, her academic perspective offering unique insights into how they presented technology to the public. The collaboration between literature professor and tech executives had raised some eyebrows initially, but the results were undeniable. Alexander joined them backstage, his presence immediately calming. Everything's ready. Emma, are you sure you want to lead the presentation? No, Emma said firmly. Atlas is my project. I need to be the one to introduce it to the world. Alexander smiled proudly. Of course you do. Just remember, start with the human element, not the technical specifications, Emma finished. James has only reminded me about 50 times. 53, actually, James corrected with a smirk. But who's counting? A stage manager approached. 5 minutes, Ms. Williams. Emma took a deep breath, reviewing her mental notes. The presentation was simple, really. Show them Atlas in action, demonstrate how it could transform urban transportation, explain how it would make life better for both drivers and passengers. She'd done this dozens of times in smaller settings. She could do this. Emma, Alexander said softly, Whatever happens out there, know that you've already succeeded. You built something extraordinary, entirely on your own terms. Not entirely on my own, Emma corrected, looking between her father and brother. Not anymore, the stage manager returned. We're ready. Emma stepped onto the stage, the lights momentarily blinding her. As her eyes adjusted, she found her mother's face in the front row, beaming with pride. Charlotte gave her a subtle thumbs up, and Emma felt her nervousness transform into excitement. Good morning, she began, her voice strong and clear. My name is Emma Williams, and I'm here to show you the future of urban transportation. The presentation flowed smoothly. Emma guided the audience through Atlas's development, from her early days gathering data as a taxi driver to the sophisticated system it had become. She demonstrated live simulations, showing how the AI could predict and respond to transportation needs across entire cities. When she opened the floor for questions, the journalists leaned forward eagerly. Ms. Williams, one called out, is it true that you developed this system while working as a taxi driver? Yes, Emma replied. I believed that to truly understand urban transportation, I needed to experience it firsthand. Every fare, every traffic jam, every conversation with passengers helped shape Atlas into what it is today. And how does it feel to be working with your father's company on this project? Emma glanced at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly. When I started developing Atlas, I had no idea about my connection to Blackwood Enterprises. But finding my family has been as revolutionary as any technology. They've helped make this project stronger, just as working together has made our relationship stronger. James stepped forward then, right on cue. Blackwood Enterprises is proud to announce that Atlas will be launching as a pilot program in London next month, with plans for expansion to other major cities by the end of the year. The questions continued, technical and personal intertwining. Emma handled them all with growing confidence, supported by James's business acumen and Alexander's strategic insights. From the audience, Charlotte watched her daughter command the room, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. As the presentation concluded, Emma felt a profound sense of rightness. Atlas had begun as her solitary vision, born in the quiet hours driving London's streets, but it had become something more, a bridge between worlds, between family members, between past and future. The applause was thunderous. As Emma left the stage, she was enveloped in a family embrace, her mother's perfume, her father's steady presence, her brother's congratulatory pat on the back. They had all taken such different paths to reach this moment, but somehow those paths had converged exactly when they needed to. Well done, little sister, James murmured. Though next time try not to outshine the rest of us quite so thoroughly. Emma laughed. No promises. Innovation runs in the family, remember? Alexander wrapped an arm around each of his children. Speaking of family, I believe your mother mentioned something about a celebration dinner. At the little cafe in Hampstead, Charlotte confirmed, joining them, where it all began. As they made their way out of the press conference, reporters still calling questions, Emma felt the weight of her mother's ring on her finger. The ring that had started everything, leading her to a father she never knew she had, a brother she never expected to love, and a future she had built on her own terms. Some might call it chance, she thought. But maybe it was something else, an algorithm of fate, bringing the right people together at the right time, like her beloved Atlas system, orchestrating the perfect journey. 1 year after the Atlas launch, Emma stood in front of a black taxi parked outside King's College. It wasn't just any taxi, it was her original mobile laboratory, now preserved as a reminder of where everything began. The vehicle had been restored and modified to serve as a demonstration model for the Atlas system, which was now operating successfully across London. Ready for your big moment? Alexander asked, joining her on the sidewalk. Emma smiled, touching the silver ring that still adorned her finger. As ready as I'll ever be. Inside the college's grand lecture hall, Charlotte was concluding her newest series, Technology and Literature, the Human Stories Behind Innovation. Today's final lecture featured a special guest speaker, her daughter. It's fitting that we're here, Alexander said, looking up at the historic building. Your mother always said universities were where different worlds could meet. Speaking of different worlds meeting, Emma grinned, is James still trying to convince his latest date that he really does have a taxi-driving sister who revolutionized urban transportation? Actually, James's voice came from behind them. She didn't believe me until I showed her your Forbes cover. Emma turned to, see her brother approaching, impeccably dressed as always, but with a more relaxed air about him these days. The past year had softened many of his sharp edges, as he'd discovered that sharing the family spotlight hadn't diminished his own achievements. The mighty James Blackwood, showing off his sister's accomplishments, Emma teased. Will wonders never cease? Well, someone has to keep your ego in check now that Atlas is expanding internationally, he retorted good-naturedly. They entered the lecture hall together, finding it packed with students and faculty. Charlotte stood at the podium, her silver-streaked hair elegant against her academic robes, looking completely in her element. And now, Charlotte was saying, I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker. A year ago, she was calculating routes through London's busy streets. Today, her AI system is transforming urban transportation across Europe. More importantly, her journey reminds us that technology's greatest power lies not in its algorithms, but in its ability to bring people together. Please welcome Emma Williams Blackwood. The hyphenated surname had been Emma's choice, made 6 months after the Atlas launch. It represented both her independent achievements as Emma Williams and her connection to the family legacy she'd unexpectedly inherited. As Emma took the podium, she saw her family in the front row. Alexander radiating pride, James pretending not to be moved, and Charlotte beaming with maternal joy. Behind them sat the Atlas development team, including Patricia Chen, who had become both colleague and friend. Thank you, Professor Williams, Emma began with a playful formality that made her mother laugh. When I started driving a taxi 3 years ago, I thought I was just gathering data for a transportation algorithm. I didn't know I was also driving toward my own history, my own family, my own future. She proceeded to tell their story, not just the technical achievements of Atlas, but the human journey that had accompanied it. She spoke about innovation born from necessity, about the unexpected ways technology could bridge personal divides, about the importance of understanding the human elements behind every system. Atlas works, she explained, because it recognizes that every journey is part of a larger pattern. Change one route, and you affect countless others. The same is true of our lives. One chance encounter, one revealed secret, one moment of truth, these can alter everything that follows. As she spoke, Emma could see students furiously taking notes, but she also noticed the tears in Charlotte's eyes, the proud smile on Alexander's face, the thoughtful expression on James's usually composed features. My mother taught me that every story matters, she continued. My father showed me that innovation comes in many forms. My brother reminded me that success means nothing without family to share it with. And they all taught me that it's never too late to find your way home. After the lecture, they gathered in Charlotte's office, where a familiar copy of Jane Eyre sat on the desk, its green-inked inscription still visible on the inside cover. I have something to show you all, Alexander announced, pulling out his phone. The latest Atlas data shows that our original taxi route, the one where Emma and I first met, has become one of the most efficient in the city. The AI keeps selecting it as an optimal path. The algorithm has a sense of poetry, Charlotte mused. It knows where the important journeys begin. Speaking of beginnings, James added, the board approved our expansion into smart city integration yesterday. Emma, they want you to lead the project. Really? Emma looked surprised. But that's a director-level position. And well-deserved, Alexander confirmed. Though you'll have to give up your taxi license. Emma touched her mother's ring again, a habit she'd developed when making important decisions. Actually, I think I'll keep it, just as a reminder of where I came from. Where we all came from, James corrected. Though if you ever tell anyone I drove a taxi during our system tests, I'll deny everything. They laughed together, these 4 people who had become a family in the most unexpected way. Through the office window, they could see the old taxi parked below, its black surface gleaming in the London sunshine. You know, Charlotte said softly, some might call it coincidence. My giving you that ring, your car breaking down that day, all of it. I prefer to think of it as an optimal routing, Emma replied. All the variables aligning at exactly the right moment. Like a well-designed algorithm, Alexander added. Or a well-written story, Charlotte suggested. Or maybe, James concluded, just family finding its way home. They stood together, looking out at the city that had brought them together, its streets now running more smoothly thanks to Atlas, its stories now richer for the ones they'd written together. Above them, London's endless pattern of journeys continued, each one carrying its own possibility of connection, of discovery, of coming home. Emma's phone buzzed with a notification from the Atlas system. Somewhere in the city, a taxi was taking an unexpected route, creating ripples through the network, showing once again that the best journeys aren't always the ones we plan. But sometimes they're exactly the ones we need.